1. 2 days before the earth went insane, Josh Standing was trying hard not to bring an end to his own personal world. Josh made a fist and tried to shift the anger that wanted to come out of his mouth and stuff it down into the bones of his hand. All he succeeded in doing was thumping the desk in front of him, barking his knuckles on the satellite radio apparatus. He cursed under his breath at the stinging pain. "What?" Maxine's voice was coming through from Boston, tinny and thin. Even in that state, it had not been shorn of the bitter anger transported by the degraded signal. "Nothing," Josh muttered. "I hit my hand. Just get over telling me what a useless father I've been to our son so that I can speak to him." Maxine's sigh came through loud and clear, and Josh sucked on his grazed knuckles, as much to soothe them as to stifle the stream of harsh words that threatened to rise to her bait. 22 years of marriage and 2 kids, Tally, now being 18 and Storm 21, had educated both parties enough for them to know exactly which buttons to press to drive the stiletto of an argument through the ribs of past passion. Josh and Maxine argued now in very much the same way as they'd used to make love, hot and fevered, neither taking any prisoners in the pursuit of liberation from internal tensions. Now the goal seemed to be to hurt each other just as deeply as they had once wanted to give each other pleasure. Same drives employed, different destinations. Josh had promised himself before this call that he would not give Maxine the satisfaction of rising to her provocation. It was a promise he was already coming perilously close to breaking. It wasn't that he was blameless in all this, as he knew he wasn't. It took 2 to tango, after all, and it only took 1 to be the bigger man, to apologize, to be the first one to apologize. But Maxine and Josh had pretty much reached the point where no one was willing to go first in pouring the much-needed oil on the troubled waters of their marriage. "Toe tack." A sliver of guilt cut into Josh's heart as the voice on the transmitter changed to that of his son. That Storm was obviously trying to take the heat out of the situation by using the silly ritual greeting they developed when he was very much younger, gave Josh pause, and he didn't offer the expected response right away. When Josh had still been a cop, he tried to teach 4-year-old Storm tic-tac-toe, and although the boy had grasped the game, he could never get words in the name of it in the right order. Storm would say, "Let's play toe-tack-tick," and Josh would immediately reply, "tic-tac-toe." Over time, this attempted corrective had become their standard conversational opener, and toe-tack and tic-tac had morphed into nicknames of sorts. And here, still fizzing with his irritation at Maxine, Josh hesitated. He wet his dry lips and tried to get back in the game. "Toe-tack, you there, Dad? Has this stupid thing gone down again?" "I'm here, son." "Then," Storm's voice caught a crack, "say the words." It wasn't like you could hear cancer as a tone in someone's voice, but the effects of it could be easily identified if you knew what to listen for. The breathiness of fatigue, the shudder of pain, the trembling of uncertainty over one's personal future. Maxine and Josh had not necessarily become the cliché of a couple who'd stayed together because of the kids. They were damn close. Had Storm Standing's non-Hodgkin's lymphoma not been diagnosed less than a year before, then Josh and Maxine might never even have reached the stage of almost becoming that cliché. "Hey, Tic-Tac. How's things?" "Pretty rough." Storm was in Boston, 800 miles and change from the Standings family home in Morehead City, North Carolina. He was having his final R-CHOP chemotherapy sessions in the Travis Institute. A long way to go for chemo, but the oncologist there, Sudhindra, had been a friend to both Josh and Maxine since their college days, and had all but fallen over himself to help in the only way he could when he'd heard about Storm's initial diagnosis over the social media telegraph. "It's the least I can do, Josh," he said in his high, earnest voice, which had seemed fired out of the past like a flaming arrow of hope on the telephone. The least he could do. The least Maxine and Josh could have done, the ex-cop thought, was to stop pecking pieces out of each other at every opportunity and concentrate on their son's recovery. The least. Storm's treatment had been fraught with side effects and debilitating post-chemo complications. Basically, to poison and kill the cancer, you had to poison and very nearly kill the body. Storm had said to his dad on many occasions that the treatment was worse than the cancer itself. "It isn't worse than dying," he'd say, "but sometimes I'd choose that over this." Once the poisons with the long and complicated Latin names, which Josh was convinced, if translated into English, would come out as Kilomatic, Vamokaz, or Dioshore, had been pumped by Sudhindra and his team into Storm's body, there would be a sudden and alarming deterioration in Storm's condition. The first course of drugs some 16 weeks before, which Josh had made the trip to Boston with his son for, had caused him to think his son had relapsed and been pushed close to death. Such was the change in him. The sickness, the pain, the hair coming out in clumps, the pallor and the listlessness, nothing in his eyes. He'd raged at Sudhindra, talking of lawsuits and lawyers, and the tiny Indian in the too large white coat had smiled, taken Josh by the hand, and explained for perhaps the 30th time that this is all to be expected, and that the body doesn't enjoy being poisoned, but the cancer in Storm's lymph and skeletal system will enjoy it even less. "I'm sorry, son," Josh said now, snapping back to the matter at hand. "It's your last course, though. After this, it'll be only up. You'll be back on the track training before you know it." "I hope so." Storm didn't sound so sure. "How's the vacation?" Josh's stomach nodded at the word. A Maxine word, if ever there'd been one. Because he knew Maxine was listening in on speaker, Josh had two choices. He could correct his 21-year-old son and say he wasn't on vacation, and this wasn't a fun trip, it was strictly business and was part of his job. Or he could not rise to the bait she'd placed on Storm's hook and just roll with it. He chose the latter. "Oh, it's all okay here. Everyone is basically outside looking up at the sky. Are you going out to look? It's damn beautiful. Never seen anything like it." In his mind's eye, Maxine's lips pursed and her fingers drummed on her knees. He could imagine that she'd have much preferred Josh to correct Storm, which would in effect have given her another stick to beat him with, the stick of taking out his anger at her on his gravely ill son. "We could see it all from the window of the hotel once we pulled back the drapes. It's amazing, like a bag of jewels spilled in a corner of the sky." Josh smiled at the comment. If Storm hadn't been such a strong runner before his diagnosis, he could just as easily have been a strong and descriptive poet. Now that he was getting a second bite at the cherry of life, perhaps he could be both. His job as an administrative assistant in the accounts department of Moorhead Mercy, in thanks part to Maxine being a nurse specialist at the same hospital, was being held open for him. It would give him something to help get his life back on track. The running, that may take a little longer. "Did you see the news last night?" "Nope. What did I miss?" Josh asked. Normally, he was a more than a little hardcore news junkie, but out here, there were too many other distractions to keep him busy. Distractions that also helped him concentrate on something other than the collapse of his marriage and the illness of his son, if only for a few weeks. And that brought another cold chill of guilt to his mind, which he was determined not to show in his voice. How did it all come to this? He thought. How? Storm continued. Professor Halley, the TV science guy, he was going so crazy on Conan last night that they had to cut to commercials. And then he went psycho on CNN, and they just shut him down. He was saying some pretty crazy stuff. I thought you might... Not at times, Storm. Sorry. It's not a vacation. But he kept that last part to himself. Storm's voice had an enthusiasm in it which belied his physical frailty and fatigue right now. And it suddenly felt good for Josh to hear that tone in the boy's voice. It had certainly been a while. Professor Robert Halley was tangentially known to Josh, a pop culture scientist who used to have his own show back in the late 90s, where he would debunk science myths and promote rational inquiry. He'd been a massive proponent of space exploration when firing tax dollars beyond the Earth's atmosphere had not been a hugely popular stance to take. That's when he'd fallen out of favor with the networks, and instead retired to write books and trawl the lecture circuit. These days, He often turned up on talk and news segments as a rent-a-science dude, a man in his late 50s with bug-eyed glasses and hair in a dirty blonde ponytail that made him look like a refugee from the Grateful Dead, rather than MIT. Josh remembered Storm watching him on YouTube when he'd gone through his question everything phase and considered Hallie a great communicator, if a little weird. He thinks there's going to be some kind of problem with the supernova. 2 nights ago, a sparkling smudge to the side of Orion's belt had lit up the night sky like a smeared moon. First, it had been a white dot, which the people who'd first seen it had thought to be an approaching aircraft, but it had grown visibly as the watchers had observed it with increasing concern. When it had become a blurry, pearlescent splotch on the night sky, like the negative image of a Rorschach test, the world's media had gone into overdrive. Mainly because of the new light in the sky, but also, it seemed, because NASA and all the other major observatories of the world had been taken completely by surprise. Once the telescopes and instruments of the world had been trained on the still-growing object, now brighter than the stars around it, jaw-dropping information had begun spreading. Barnard's star, at 6 light-years distance, the closest star which could be seen in the Earth's northern hemisphere, had exploded. The supernova, catastrophically destroying itself in a stellar detonation, had thus sent out a wave of light, which was now, 6 years later, just becoming visible on Earth. The spectacle, and it surely was unusual, had turned almost everyone on the planet into an amateur astronomer overnight. The ufologists had called it alien intervention, and fundamentalists had called it a sign from their own particular deities of choice. Many people had been flocking to churches, and a similar number had flocked to bars. Humanity had done what it always did when something strange and wonderful happened. Everyone reached for their crutch of choice and leaned on it as heavily as they could. What was Hallie saying? Josh asked, wanting to keep his son talking. Crazy stuff, Dad. He said the government was keeping the truth secret, and they knew a lot more than they were letting on. He said that he had sources within NASA and the NSA who were trying to get the news of the dangers out to the world, and they were being stopped at every turn. Sure sounds crazy. He looked terrible, Dad. Never seen him look so scared. Conan asked if Hallie's psychiatrist was as concerned, for a cheap laugh, and then on CNN, they cut away from him, and he tried to get back in front of the cameras, and you could see security hauling him off screen. It'll be on YouTube. I can send you the link. Thanks. I'll get the popcorn. Storm laughed. It was a good sound, and made Josh feel so much better. It also made him feel better that Maxine, sitting next to Storm, would have hated it, coming as a response to Josh's comment, just as much as Josh had loved it. And then he felt like a heel for thinking that. How, again, did it come to this? Hallie was saying, we've never had a supernova happen so close to our solar system before, so we don't know what's going to be riding the wave behind the light. Conan reached behind his desk and held up a surfboard and said he was ready to hang 10 in the stars like the Silver Surfer. Josh could almost hear the audience's laughter in his head as Storm relayed the story. He imagined Hallie's eyes, darting confusedly behind his bug-eyed glasses, his lips thin and his hands trembling on his knees. Public humiliation was the surefire way to prick someone's bubble. And when you could add gaslit layers of suggested crazy onto that, all the better. What stuff riding the wave? Josh asked after a moment. What did he mean? Dunno, Dad. They never really let him get it out, but he looked terrified. Josh thought of the others now, outside, looking at the smudge. The sky over this wilderness was wide and cloudless tonight. The young people in his charge weren't what you call readers of Nature or National Geographic, but even they had been moved to kick back, forget their attitude for a few hours, and look up at the beautiful spectacle high above them, moving slowly across the sky. Josh had been tempted to stay outside with them longer, but his call to Maxine and Storm had been scheduled already, the satellite time booked. Even a tense exchange with Maxine was worth it to rub away the guilt he felt about being out here instead of in Boston with his son. Josh knew that he could have bugged out on the trip, too. His boss would have understood. He knew that if he'd not stuck his heels in and made sure his 19-year-old daughter Tally had also come along with him, instead of giving in to her insistence of staying home while both parental units were separated by space, time, and emotional breakdown. He'd have had more than enough reason to cry off. But Josh wasn't the crying off kind. This trip had been planned for over a year. It was important not just to Josh and his bosses in the Moorhead City Probation Service, but could and should be important to the young men he'd brought out here. These were kids who'd been let down their whole lives by their peers, their parents, and yes, the system Josh was a part of. And as no one else in the department had had the time or the inclination to replace him on the trip, well, if Josh hadn't gone, then the trip wouldn't have happened. And under those circumstances, he'd have just become another letdown for those kids. One in the long line of letdowns. Just another blur in their headlong trajectory toward lawless oblivion. So, he'd weighed it up. This was Storm's last course of chemo, and Maxine had the vacation time from her position as wound care specialist nurse at Moorhead Mercy. And so he had come out here, Tally almost kicking and screaming, but in the end accepting that she wasn't going to be left alone to her own devices. And he'd ridden a wave of guilt every damn mile of the journey. Bzzzt. The satellite radio buzzed and crackled. The indicator lights flashed, and somewhere inside the box, something electrical made a sick, crunching sound. The light over his head flickered, and the wood-paneled room was plunged momentarily into darkness before, after 2 or 3 seconds, the light regained its luminosity, and the satellite radio box stopped flashing and burping. Storm? Storm? You still there? Silence. Josh twisted the dials and turned the machine off and on again in the universal panacea for all errant tech, but the machine only lit up. It didn't connect. There wasn't even the usual carrier signal for him to lock onto. The lights were on, but nobody was home. A thudding headache kicked in behind Josh's forehead, a proper 10-tonner. The iron of it kicked against his skull and almost rattled his teeth out of his jaw. He'd suffered migraines as a kid, but thought he'd outgrown them since he hadn't had one like this since before college. There were painkillers in his pack, stored beneath his bunk, but such was the eye-squinting ferocity of the pain that Josh didn't know in the moment if he'd be able to get upright and reach them. And then, almost as if a switch in his head had been flicked, the dagger of pain sheathed itself softly back into a dull ache, and he could open his eyes without wanting to throw up. "What the hell was that?" he breathed aloud to the empty room. He blinked a couple of times and rubbed his temple. Perhaps it had been his body reminding him that the last year had been pretty intense, what with Storm, Maxine, and the trip. He shook his head as much to clear the pain as to get the truth of how hard he'd been pushing himself out of mind. Josh sighed, rubbed his eyes, and got up, vowing to try again later with the satellite radio, figuring Storm would be up a few hours more to observe the smudge hanging with its starry glitter like a party in the sky. He walked to the door, more unsteady on his feet than he'd expected, and having to leave heavily on the door jamb as he pulled the beautifully tooled and brass-handled door open. The gust of a stiff but not unpleasantly chill breeze washed over his face as he climbed the ladder. The dark sky above was a dusting of stars, and the Bernard star supernova cloud, still constantly expanding and brightening, now totally owned its corner of the sky. Halfway up the ladder, before his head crested fully into the open air, the pain kicked back into his temples, taking his breath out of his lungs in one agonizing thump. A moan of pain leaked from his mouth, and it was matched from one from above. He recognized the voice which had made it, but for one moment, because of the hammering between his own ears, he couldn't put a name to it. But it was a sound that hacked at his heart as much as the headache hacked at his head. Gritting his teeth and the handrail as hard as he could, Josh hauled himself up the last few rungs, and then, finding that the effort seemed to have shorn the muscles in his legs of all their power, he pitched forward and slithered like a freshly landed fish out into the open. For a moment, the smell of the varnished wood close to his nostrils was redolent of college basketball courts or musty museums. There came a clutch of myriad pasts hooking onto memories, But as soon as they had burst into bright light in his mind, the loosed iron ore rolling around his brain pan bowled through those mirages like it was a ball made from nails and blades. "Dad? Dad?" Josh felt a hand take his and squeeze its own panic into his bones. He managed to open eyelids that had been stapled shut with pain and look along the planks on which he lay. Tally Standing, his daughter, her blonde hair flapping and fluttering in the breeze, was prone on the varnished planking, her face twisted into a mask of agony. Behind her, he could see other bodies slumped over or collapsed, hands on temples, knees drawn up into fetal agonies, some of the boys rolling and crashing into each other as if they were trying to escape their own bodies. Above him, as Josh twisted his eyes up, he could see the sails and the rigging lit by the deck lights, and he could feel the roll of the Seahawk as it rode the swells of the Atlantic. Up, between the spars and the ropes, between the ladders and the sheets of the Clipper's rigging, the smudge of the Bernard Star explosion now festered in the sky. It was no longer beautiful. The glitter and majesty of its spilled jewels had changed completely. It showed tinge of red, a tracery of black, and the sickness of unwholesome green. Now the exploding stellar object, which had awed every eye on the planet, was a suppurating sore between the stars, dripping its infection onto the earth.